everyone. I'll say a belated Happy New Year and welcome to 2022. And also welcome to the Eugene Planning Commission meeting for January 11th, 2022. I don't think we have any attendees, but I thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using as we continue to deal with the pandemic. These Zoom meetings allow us to meet and take care of business while we keep our members, our staff, and the public safe. Today, we're continuing our deliberations on the draft amendments to the city's land use code and also the Metro Plan that are required to implement Oregon House Bill 2001. I want to note as we start that anybody who wants to access this meeting can do so by watching the live stream that's available on the website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by following the access instructions that are listed on the agenda for the meeting. If you do join the meeting via computer device or phone, please note your microphone, your webcam, and phone are all automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. So with that, I want to go ahead and move to agenda item A, deliberations, Middle Housing Code amendments. And I'm going to turn it over to Terry Harding and to Jeff Gepper to lead us through this discussion and our continued review.
Can I have a point of order, Chair Beeson?
You can, yes.
I just want to point out that there we go. Commissioner Taylor was in the attendees room, so.
Okay. I think Jeff was, okay, I think we've got that. That's good. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Terry and Jeff. And so Terry, take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner Beeson. Happy New Year, everyone. Good to see you in 2022. Give me just a second here to share my screen. We've got a process that you're pretty familiar with at this point. But of course, it's giving me a little bit of trouble just for a New Year challenge. Hold on a sec. Okay, someone give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the correct information. Good, no notes or anything?
We are seeing the note screen.
You are seeing the note screen, I knew it. How about now? Okay, great. Thanks for your patience. So it's January 11th, and we're on part 4 of our deliberations on Middle Housing Code amendments. So we've already had 3 sessions where you've been working hard to go through the different sections of your recommendation. Today's agenda is to review the project goals for House Bill 2001 implementation, and then move into a series of topics, the last ones that we have left, and wrap up with next steps. So the project goals haven't changed. They are to, first and foremost, comply with the House Bill, which has many parts and components. Secondly, to further ongoing work aimed at addressing equity and affordability, and to enable more production of diverse types of housing across Eugene. This chart shows our latest schedule for the adoption phase of the Middle Housing Code amendments. If our local code is not in place by June 30th of 2022, the state's model code will directly apply. And we're in the home stretch here in January of the Planning Commission process. Once you wrap up your work scheduled for the end of this month, we will prepare a package of your recommendations for the City Council. And they will hold a work session and their own public hearing in March, and then we anticipate, deliberate, and take action in April. When we were doing the outreach that fed into the code writing, we discovered several themes, strong themes that emerged from the outreach done with different groups and with the general public. And as a reminder, those themes include equity and inclusion as code choices are made on how to promote middle housing development. Secondly, to encourage and incentivize middle housing across the community. Thirdly, near transit routes to encourage compact development by reducing parking requirements. And then lastly, to pursue incentives and programs beyond the land use code as part of our ongoing housing work. These themes will come back to you as we get to the discussion about what items you'd like to highlight for the City Council. This is a reminder of the information that we have been using to explain the draft code to the public. So we published this guide to the adoption process back in the fall. It's on our website, and we gathered public testimony at the email address there listed on the page. The main content of this guide is comparison tables that show for every standard or major standard what the minimum standard is in the state rules, what would be required by the model code, and then what the proposed Eugene standard is. And the color coding here that says encourage and incentivize shows where those standards lie on the spectrum of allow, encourage, or incentivize middle housing. The important point at this point in time is to let you know that we plan to update this entire guide to reflect your recommendations and your deliberations. So you've been through version 1, 2, and now we're on version 3 of the code. And once you're done, we will update the the guide to the adoption package and call it the Guide to the Planning Commission Recommendation and publish that for both City Council and the general public in February. At your last meeting, we talked a lot about middle housing affordability, and one of your discussions was to direct staff to do some further work on this. So when Jeff starts his presentation, he'll give you some more details about this, but I wanted to point out 2 different paths to affordability as was explained in your AIS. There are land use code things we can do to promote middle housing affordability, and they include things like reduced lot size and reduced parking requirements. And again, the actual code language for this will be in Jeff's part. And then beyond the land use code, we are beginning to explore what it would mean to do a density bonus, for example, from a 4-plex to a 6-plex, and also contemplating fee reductions and tax exemptions as part of the middle housing incentives through the Housing Implementation Pipeline, or HIP. I'd also like to point out that another recommendation and line item in the HIP is a citywide anti-displacement plan. We've heard public comment and concerns about displacement of existing housing or renters. And this plan is recommended to address all types of housing, not just middle housing. So this is a list of the topics that are on deck for today, and it's my last slide before I hand it over to Jeff. And just to give you a little preview of what's coming, he'll hand it back to me for the last item as we start to talk about what items you'd like to highlight for council. So at this point, I'd like to stop sharing. I don't know why that's on my other screen, but there we go. And hand it over to Jeff to walk you through the code.
Awesome, thank you, Terry, and good evening, everybody. So one of my New Year's resolutions is to not talk so much and provide a little bit more opportunity for y'all to deliberate. So I'm going to share my screen like I normally do. As Terry mentioned, these are, and just to double check, everybody can see that presentation, correct? Perfect. I'm going to go quickly through some of the last remaining code issues that we have on deck, talk about those income qualified incentives that we said we'd bring back to you, and then discuss the Metro Plan policy amendment and findings. So to dive right in, for context, the cottage cluster parking standards was something that we said we would bring back to you as staff for discussion and provide you a little bit of context. And so here's the context. We were questioning the amount or the number of spaces that are allowed to be before you need a landscape buffer. So here in the drawing, you can see it's 5 spaces and then a landscape buffer and then 5 spaces. And then for larger cottage clusters, that would be 8 contiguous spaces. And Commissioner Taylor rightfully brought up the existing code for example, for multifamily developments or large commercial developments are allowed to have 10 contiguous spaces. And this does exist in code, but it exists in code through implementation of the standards. Basically, the standards have a dimension and a length that you can have so many parking spots for a length before you have to have a landscape island. So it doesn't explicitly say 10, but the math gets you to 10. So for those other standards, it is 10 contiguous spaces. Obviously, we based the number of contiguous spaces that you're seeing here on what the model code says. That's where this language comes from. In terms of for cottage clusters with fewer than 16 cottages, you can have 5 contiguous spaces, or more than that is 8 contiguous spaces. And I believe Commissioner Taylor was interested in pursuing making it consistent with the other section of code where it would be 10 contiguous spaces would be allowed before you either need a landscape buffer or a separate parking area. So with that context, I'll open it up for any questions or for folks to deliberate whether or not we should keep it as is, or if we should be changing these numbers to align with other parts of code. Comments, questions, thoughts? Would anybody like to recommend that we keep it the same or move towards?
I think Commissioner Taylor has her physical hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, my videos aren't that far down at the moment. Commissioner Taylor, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm on yet a different device, so I couldn't even figure out where my tile is on this one. I still maintain my proposal based on public testimony, and as Jeff concisely described, is that there's other references in the code and to maintain that consistency. So I would like to propose not more than 10 contiguous spaces.
And to be clear, Commissioner Taylor, that's regardless of the number of cottages. So we would just say that cottage cluster projects with are permitted parking clusters of not more than 10 contiguous spaces, right?
That's what I would propose, yes. Thank you for clarifying.
And so with that on the table, is there any other discussion or deliberations that folks want to have? Commissioner Isaacson.
Yeah, can you just help me out with what is the purpose of a landscape buffer just for aesthetics, or is there something from a design standpoint that adds to it? I mean, if the idea is, if we're going to incentivize parking, get as many people to be able to park their car as opposed to the street and kind of flow out into the neighborhood, if it's a choice between that and a landscape buffer, that seems like an easy decision to me. But if there's something else, I'd like to know what that is.
It is primarily design, aesthetics, and to break up large expanses of pavement. And so that directly relates to the aesthetics component of it. And it's to add landscaping features within large areas of pavement. So that's the entire intent behind these things, is to not just have wide open spaces, especially in the context of a residential environment.
To dovetail off that, if we're going to go down that road, and one of the attacks or counter arguments to what we've heard in the past has been the reduction in tree canopy. Could you explore the idea of suggesting that if you're going to have a landscape buffer, that a tree, if it's a certain width, be placed in one, so you're adding trees to the development?
Given that the way that the minimum standards in the model code is written, I do not believe that we would be able to require that a tree could be put there. 4-foot landscaping buffer is enough for a tree to be placed, but I do not think that we would be able to require it.
Just to tag on to what Jeff said, Commissioner Isaacson, this is a situation where the city is allowed to be more, or I'm sorry, less restrictive than the model code, or the same as the model code, but not more restrictive than the model code. And so when we start to think about adding regulations, that starts to look potentially more restrictive.
Are there any other follow-up conversations? Otherwise, I can take a straw poll on support for Commissioner Taylor's recommendation. So seeing no hands at this point, I'll take a straw poll with everyone to have staff amend this standard to say that cottage clusters are permitted parking clusters of not more than 10 contiguous spaces. This is regardless of the number of cottages within a cluster. You're allowed to have at least 10 contiguous spaces in a row. So with that, I'll ask for commissioners in support of that change. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, great. We will move on to the next question, which is also related to cottage cluster parking. And this is a standard for parking location. So this is Section A here. We had a little bit of a conversation at our last deliberations, which was almost a month ago at this point. And the limitation here, it says off-street parking areas with 5 or more spaces shall not be located within 20 feet of any property line that abuts a street. And so here, in this example, what you would be seeing here is the 20-foot minimum. So the screening is also required, but basically the question was raised whether or not it should, if 20 feet was the right distance. And to be clear, in this instance, we would be able to reduce the 20 feet. So you could go lower than 20 feet, but we do not believe that we could go higher than that. I see Commissioner Taylor has raised her hand.
Thank you. Once again, I was the one who brought this up, and it's basically there was quite a bit of public testimony that kind of questioned this. We're trying to get more housing, and these are fairly small, condensed, kind of denser developments. And what I think is to be more equitable with other parts of the code is to just require the screening, the buffer, and not have this so relax that 20 feet. You're still going to get that presence on the street frontage because as this illustrates, the housing is there. It's just on the side, you're going to have parking that just comes a little closer to the street. So I am a proponent of just providing the minimum screening and not the additional full 20 feet.
And just to provide additional context here, I did provide enough detail here to show that subsection C in this area, it does say that no off-street parking space is permitted within 10 feet of a property line external to the cottage cluster, with the exception of along an alley. So you could have parking spaces closer to an alley, but basically what this says is that like de facto, if you get rid of the standard at A and remove the 20 feet, it would be 10 feet still. So just want to call that out. The difference between the two is that this says no off-street parking space and this says no off-street parking area. So in reading that, if you remove this section entirely, I do think that you may be able to have maneuvering area or a backup area that would get closer to the road. That's a really, really detailed code nuance. So it would be staff's recommendation that this gets reduced. You would, instead of just removing subsection A here, you would just make that 10 feet to align with the section below. So Commissioner Taylor, if you would comment on that recommendation, I'm curious to hear your input.
I think that's consistent with the setbacks in single family. So I actually think that's applicable. I think it makes sense. Yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions on this section? All right, well, with that, I'll take a straw poll to amend the parking location and access to say that off-street parking areas with 5 or more spaces shall not be located within 10 feet of any property line that abuts a street. And so with that, I'll say which planning commissioners are in support of that change. see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, moving right along. We're going to move into the conversion of structures. Commissioner Taylor, yes, I see you have your hand up. Oh, is that just a holdover? So we discussed this briefly and got general input from the Planning Commission that you were interested in seeing the conversion of structures into middle housing kind of brought to encompass a little bit more. And so staff has come back with this recommendation. And so for a touch of context here, we're talking about when the conversion of a building triggers the middle housing special development standards. So if you have an existing house, or you have an existing church, or an existing B&B or triplex or whatever, and you want to convert it into a different type of middle housing, you have to meet the special development standards for middle housing when you go through that conversion, unless, under the way that it was previously written, unless you were an existing single unit dwelling. And so only if you were a single unit dwelling did you get that exemption from the middle housing standards. And so staff basically came forth and said, well, it actually makes sense to encompass more structure or more buildings within that exemption, so that if you have a duplex and you want to make an internal conversion of one of those units into 2 and turn it into a triplex, that you don't have to all of a sudden meet the window coverage standards or the building orientation standards and other things that might apply for the middle housing. And so we developed this proposed change to this, this exemption section. And this also applies to parking space requirements. I'll touch on that in a second. But so we changed it to basically say that middle housing development standards do not apply to a duplex, triplex, or fourplex created through the addition to or conversion of an existing building, excluding accessory buildings. And so we explicitly excluded accessory buildings because if you have a detached garage, it's likely not constructed in a way that really is intended for conversion into a residential unit of that nature. So we really wanted to make sure that this was focused on true buildings on residential lands. And so that's the upper section here is regarding the applicability of the middle housing development standards. The lower section here is basically saying that if you go through this conversion process, you're not triggering additional parking requirements. And so this was another situation where previously it was only when you converted a single family dwelling unit into middle housing, you got this exception, whereas now we're proposing that to be any conversion of a building on a residential or on a lot where middle housing is permitted. And so I know that's a pretty nuanced, small piece of code, but staff felt it was important to kind of encourage other opportunities to develop middle housing. So I want to open it up for questions, comments, or deliberations. And if there are none, I'm happy to take a straw poll of support of incorporating this into the code. All right, so with that, I will take a straw poll on incorporating these 2 proposed changes that you see on the screen here regarding the conversion of middle housing dwelling units into the Planning Commission's final version of the draft code that they'll take to the City Council.
Jeff,
So,
I think I saw Commissioner Beeson might have a question.
Oh, sorry, I may have taken that support to move to a straw poll.
Oh, okay.
I thought he was taking a straw poll, so I was raising my hand. I'm in support of it. Thanks.
All right, so with that, I'll ask commissioners in support of these proposed changes. I see all 6. All right. This is a section where staff made changes. A lot of those changes were focused around some good recommendations that came from Commissioner Taylor to our adjustment review criteria. This is one of the few sections that we really haven't touched on in deliberations yet. And so I don't have any specific comments or questions about this section. Staff finds that it operates the way it's intended, especially with some of the improvements that Commissioner Taylor recommended that you saw in your copy highlighted in blue. And so I'll open it up for any questions or further suggestions for changes, if any commissioners have any. And Commissioner Fragula.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to say that I read through these and I think the changes that were suggested only strengthen this section and actually made some of the language a lot clearer to me as a layperson, which was useful.
Yeah, staff completely agrees, and it was nice to have those comments and recommendations. So with that, I'll ask for a straw poll, just recommending that these changes that you saw in version 3 are incorporated into the final document. So planning commissioners in support. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So income qualified incentives. So this is getting down to the affordability strategies. And I'll just make a quick note that, we talked about affordability strategies for anybody watching today more at length during our December 14th deliberations, where we talked a little bit about how a lot of the current recommendations that are in the code or incentives that are, encourage smaller dwelling units or provide more opportunity for middle housing, also impact and work towards providing, lowercase affordable units. And so this instance for income qualified incentives, we brought this forward as one of the few instances where we can provide some capital A income qualified incentives. They do mirror a lot of the incentives for small dwelling units. So for example, you get a lot area reduction, so you can fit more units on a lot if you have income qualified units or the small housing units. And just so you know how this is intended to operate, if you have small units and income qualified units, those don't compound on one another. So you don't get the 25% reduction twice. It would just be you only get that reduction once, regardless of if you did both things. So we added a definition for income qualified middle housing to the code, which mirrors in a lot of ways our existing controlled income and rent provisions. And then we added incentives that mirror these small dwelling units for allowing lot area reductions for anything that meets that definition of income qualified housing. But there are 2 policy decisions that are located here. And so the first one is around what low income means in the context of income qualified incentives. And so you'll see in this recommendation here, we put that being at 80% of the area median income is the staff recommendation for moving forward at this time. It's consistent with the other existing area median income thresholds within the code. And so we felt like it was a good place to start. And if through the HIP or any other sort of future research, we find that should be lowered or raised in any way, then we can incorporate those changes at that time. But at this point, our recommendation is for the 80% AMI threshold for the qualifying for income qualified middle housing. So with that, I do want to open it up for comments or questions on whether or not there's support for setting that threshold at the 80% AMI. Commissioner Fragula.
I'm wondering if you can give us any other examples within the community. So you said it's consistent with other areas in the code. And so that seems like a good consistency to me, but I'm wondering about other examples in the community that might shed some perspective.
Yeah, Terry, do you have any context from our community development folks in regards to what they responded to with this question?
Sure. And I might need some clarification from you, Commissioner Fragla, on what your question is, because there are a variety of different avenues and different income level requirements for housing that's targeted to different populations. So the city has a whole suite of programs to support different levels of housing affordability and different types of housing. At this point, I'll stop right after this. At this point, we're focusing in on applying this incentive, this code incentive, where the other more deep affordability options would be handled through the HIP. And so we'd have an opportunity to really dig in to what AMI level makes the most sense, what are the mechanisms for getting applications approved, and how much support would it take from staff at the city, all those kinds of things. This is a small piece in comparison, and so that's why we're suggesting going with the existing code provision of 80% of AMI, which is how it's defined for other code incentives such as reduced parking. Yeah.
So I can tag onto that a little bit too, Terry. Commissioner Fragla, the percentage of AMI that makes a development eligible for various city incentives changes a little bit depending on the incentive. So 80% of AMI is consistent with the controlled income and rent density bonus that lives in the land use code. The city also offers a low-income SDC exemption, and that is, folks are eligible for that at 80% of AMI for home ownership units and 60% of AMI for rental units. And then the city also offers a low-income rental housing property tax exemption, and that is for developments geared toward rents affordable to folks making 60% of AMI. So there's a scale. It depends on the incentive, but certainly there are incentives that are geared toward folks with even lower incomes. And then we also currently provide incentives geared toward folks with this 80% income range, 80% of AMI.
Great, thank you. That was helpful.
Commissioner Ramey, I believe your hand is up.
Thank you. I'll lower my hand. I'm sorry that I missed the last meeting. I missed you dearly, all of you. I did watch it, and so I got to see you in action, and it's impressive. Thank you all for the work you're doing. And in particular, it's impressive how well prepared the staff is and what a great job they're doing of leading us through this and bringing our attention to items such as this, for example. So I'm sorry I missed your last meeting, and I really appreciate the work the staff's doing and that we're all doing. I'm okay with 80% AMI. I think it's consistent with other parts of the land use code. And I also recognize that as we go forward, we're going to be constantly looking at these to see if they're effective or not. So in a sense, we're starting at somewhere, and then we're going to see where we end up. But I think 80% AMI works for me.
Chair Beeson.
Yeah, I want to agree with that. I don't have a lot to add to it. If there's some choices, it sounds like we're kind of in agreement around the 80%. I like the 80% better than the 60. I like the idea. I like the way that you've approached this, and it's part of overall the idea of encouraging the development of affordable middle housing to help provide housing where it's needed. And I think the 80% of the AMI is a good place to set it.
Excellent. Are there any other comments or questions at this time? All right, I'll take a straw poll then based on some of that general support at 80%. For those commissioners who support, as proposed, the definition of low income means having an income at or below 80% of the area median income. And support? Perfect, 6 for 80%. And so the other policy question here is the way that each one of these is written currently basically says that you only qualify for these incentives if all of the dwelling units in whatever type of middle housing it is meet the definition of income qualified. And so this would be one way of saying, okay, we are encouraging low income or income qualified, affordable housing by requiring all units in the project to be that way. The other option would be setting it at a percentage. So for example, you could say at least 50% of the units in a middle housing development have to be set and qualify for the income qualified middle housing, because potentially at that point, if you said 50%, it might pencil for a developer, be more likely that somebody might actually take advantage of the incentive. But at the same time, if you're going down that road, you get less income qualified housing units in each development by doing that. But you might actually see potentially more implementation of and usage of those provisions. So I'll open up that question for the percentage of units. Commissioner Edwards.
I'm not a developer, obviously, and I don't know, but I think that what it seems like what we've seen is what seems to work for developers is that there is a mix. And so I think that by requiring that all of the units be offered at a specific reduction, I think that might I don't know. I don't know that is I think I would support some more flexibility, I guess. I'm saying that, like, I would support setting aside a certain number of units. Of course, we're talking middle housing, so we're not talking about multifamily. So, but I do think that I don't know. I think that I'm kind of leaning towards more flexibility when it comes to the percentage of the overall units that have to be dedicated to low income. So I'll leave it at that.
Commissioner Ramey.
So I too was struck by this piece of it and encouraged to see that we would discuss it further. I was a little nervous about the all or nothing kind of situation we'd be in. And so I was hoping we could find a way to percentages. And I think there's a couple of reasons for doing this. But one is that it allows the developer some flexibility. So if they can pencil out an entire project, so 2 units, where one of those is income qualified and one is not, and they're thinking of it as a complete development. So that, I think, gives them some flexibility within what they're doing and trying to pencil out whether these are going to work or not. And then secondarily, in terms of getting a mix of use type, a mix of unit types, I think this having a percentage gets us more different types. And so I'd be in favor of a percentage. I actually started out with the kind of 1 unit per development. So that'd be 1 unit in a duplex, 1 unit in a triplex, or 1 in a quad. But maybe that's not aggressive enough. But certainly then that gives the developers some flexibility as they go ahead. If they're looking at penciling the whole development, they can make that work, having more units to work with. And secondarily, it gives us then a mix of different unit types in our units as we go forward. So that's my thought. Definitely a percentage breakdown. I could go 1 unit per development, or I could go different percentages if others would like to see more than that.
And I see that Commissioner Edwards, your hand is up. I'm gonna let Terry jump in here really quick. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Just a reminder, because this is new, these are recommendations coming from the Planning Commission, and I fully anticipate we'll get public testimony on this from housing developers and advocates as to whether they like the chosen AMI threshold and percentage or number of units. So that's just a reminder that you're at the recommendation stage, and the public will have a chance. We'll make sure to include this and in our information that we're asking for feedback on from the public. Thank you.
Commissioner Fragler.
I'm in support of having it not be all. I had been thinking about this from the second idea that Commissioner Ramey suggested, in that we get a greater differentiation and diversity in the types of housing that are available. And I also think that having a greater diversity of the types of people that can live, even though these are small developments, I think that is also beneficial to our community. So I like it from the flexibility standpoint. I like it from providing differentiated types of housing. I guess when we're talking about the percentage, I would like to see it be at least half. And I don't know how you think about the triplex. You know, it's a prime number. Yeah, so, but that would mean two out of, you know, one out of a group, that would be two out of a fourplex, and that would certainly be half of the cottage cluster, so that, you know, that could provide more affordable units, more income qualified middle housing.
And so, thank you, Commissioner Fraggle. I appreciate that. And so with the triplex, I mean, if we say 50% is the rule, obviously that's 1 unit duplex, 2 units in the fourplex, and then 50% of whatever cottage cluster is. With the way that percentages typically work in the land use code is it would require 2 units out of the triplex to be income qualified housing. So with that, I do just want to recognize that and offer a chance to say, should it be 1 for a triplex? I mean, that would be the only one that truly has an inflection point. I'm not a teacher, so I didn't think of the prime number reference, but that's very, very true. So Commissioner Isaacson.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm in complete agreement with Commissioner Ramey. I think that the more tools we give developers to arrive at this type of housing, the more likely we're going to get that type of housing. The more restrictive we are, just to let the fewer options that are on the table. And there already are so many challenges facing them to begin with. To kind of settle them with yet more of them coming out of this body would be kind of counter to what the whole objective we're doing is.
Chair Beeson.
Well, I'm in agreement too, and I'm in agreement with both Commissioner Ramey and Commissioner Fraggle. I like Commissioner Fraggle's suggestion on the 50%. I'd probably on the triplex go to 2. We could just make an executive decision to do that or write it that way in the code. But again, just trying to, get it set up to where we are encouraging, incentivizing development of the affordable housing, I think is the rationale.
Thanks, Commissioner Beeson. There any other follow-up conversations? Otherwise, I would, it sounds like there's general support for 50% set for the number of units that would require that. So I'm just going to reiterate one more time. Oh, Commissioner Taylor, I see your hand physically.
Sorry, I just want to make sure. I actually, for triplexes, you know, the one, like you said, that is really point of question. I guess I would prefer to see 1. I actually think in Senate, I agree. Actually, Commissioner Isaacson, stated it clearly, is that there are a lot of hurdles, and if we can incentivize you even to get 1, I would love to do it. So because it can be challenging. So, anyways, I just wanted to say that if that's the one in question.
And I'll just call out for reference to that cottage clusters can also have an odd number of units, and so you could end up in a similar scenario where just due to where you come out in the math, you may be required to have an additional unit be income qualified to meet that 50% threshold. So I think, are there any other final comments, or does somebody want to throw out a recommendation for what to do with the odd numbered items? Otherwise, I can just take a straw poll on the 50% threshold. Commissioner Ramey.
What about townhouses? They're just not in this program?
So they are in this program. I have that on my next slide. So the townhouses are considered as part of the townhouse project. So we defined townhouse projects as essentially 2 or more townhouses that are developed as part of, one whole. And so if you have 50% of townhouses, or, and that'd be the same scenario where if you have an odd number, you'd be required to have an additional 1. Commissioner Fragla.
So did you mention earlier that the practice is to round down and that a triplex, if it were 1.5, it would become 1, or do we have to specifically call that out? I think I prefer the 50% of dwelling units, but I'm also fine with the triplex being just 1 and an odd number of cottage clusters rounding down so that there isn't that additional requirement.
So if we just wrote 50% instead of all, you would be required to have 2 units in order to hit that 50% threshold. So we would, if you wanted to have only 1 unit in a triplex, or specifically have it round down in the cases of odd numbers, then we would have to call that out specifically in the code. But and that's possible. I see Lauren has her hand up, maybe potentially for that reason exactly.
That's exactly right. Yes, I was going to say we can write the code however the Planning Commission gives us direction. My question would be exactly what Commissioner Fragla articulated, which is if it's the will of the Planning Commission that generally 50% of the units be income qualified in order to take advantage of these incentives, does the Planning Commission want us to, in the case of an odd number unit, round up or round down? And we can then draft the code in a way that implements that direction.
Thanks, Lauren. So I'll let Chair Beeson comment, and then I'll take a straw poll on rounding up or rounding down, and then a final straw poll on the 50% requirement. Chair Beeson.
I'm ready to support the group here. I guess I just want to say, in the case of a triplex, it seems like I'm talking about something very specific, which probably isn't going to occur a lot. I would be in favor of a supporter of rounding up. Basically, I think when this occasion arises, we'd be kind of rounding towards more affordability, if I could say it like that. And I think all the way through this, to the extent we can do that and look back at those points where we've done that, I think that's a good part of what we're trying to do with the implementation of middle housing and the particular standards that we're going to be recommending back to the council. So I would be in favor of rounding up.
Commissioner Isaacson, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, just some quick, simple math. If you put the benchmark at 27%, that would cover basically the first 15 units. I mean, it's 1 out of 3 is a third, 2 out of 5 is 40%, 2 out of 7 is 28%. You know, would you numbers when you get to 3 out of 11. So if you needed a fixed number, 27% would be you're guaranteed at least that minimum is threaded.
So I think we just, in order to meet the intent of what the Planning Commission is looking for, we could draft it to meet that way. I think what I'm going to ask is exactly what Lauren posed, which is, do you want it to round up or round down? And the rounding up would result in 2 units in a triplex being required to be income qualified. Rounding down would be an instance where only 1 unit in a triplex would need to be income qualified. And Lauren, I see your hand is up.
And just to give you, one more of too many options, I think another possibility would be if Planning Commission, for some of the reasons that Commissioner Ramey and Commissioner Isaacson mentioned, wanted to say that in the instance of a triplex, 1 unit is enough to qualify. But if you are talking about a cottage cluster or a townhouse that has an odd number of units, that is, more than 3 units, say, then we round up. So you could, in fact, round up in some instances and down in others. And we could clarify that, if we're talking about 3 units or fewer, you only need to provide 1. If we're talking about 4 units or more, it's 50% and you round up to if you're on less than a full unit.
Commissioner Ramey.
I just wanted to circle back to what Terry Harding was saying, and presumably whatever number we pick here will be commented on by the development community. I just don't know. I'm not a developer. I just don't know if if 2 out of 3 units make something infeasible financially, and so we'll get 0. But if 1 out of 3 would make it feasible financially, then we would get 1. So I don't want to throw out 2 when I could have 1. I don't know how to make that decision. So that's one thing. Hopefully we'll get some feedback as we go forward. And then secondarily, if we can add this to the kinds of things we want to be sure we're evaluating through a monitoring program over the next 5 to 10 years, I think this is another good data point we'd want to find out about. So all of that goes to say, I'm probably going to support whatever it is the majority wants to go with, but knowing that we'll get some more, hopefully some more informed input on that as we go forward.
So with a lot of options on the table, Commissioner Edwards, I just saw your hand flick up. Did you want to make a comment at all?
I'm just gonna say that's what I'm hoping for. I think I'm hoping that the people who do know more, that do this more regularly, can shed some light on how this would really play out, on the ground. So I'm not gonna have too much heartburn over making the perfect decision here, but I definitely think that I would welcome input from folks who do this.
I've got Chair Beeson and then Commissioner Fragwell.
I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to support rounding down as we go through and finish this discussion off. I found Commissioner Ramey compelling.
Commissioner Fragwell? You're muted.
I'm muted. Will we have an opportunity to hear public feedback prior to recommending this to City Council, or is it going to be the City Council that's going to hear the feedback?
It will be the City Council that will hear this feedback.
Right, that's what I thought. So we are making a decision on it this night, and the City Council will get feedback. I'd still like to go with 50%, and I'm neutral on whether to round up or round down, but would support rounding down. And if we need to go through and each say what we prefer, I'm fine with that also. I also don't want it to get too complicated here, so that the code is, not going beyond. I mean, we want it to be relatively clear and objective, right? So.
Yes, we definitely want it to be clear and objective, that's for sure. So Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. I am in agreement. I like as much clear and objective. I like consistency. If we start to kind of get more and more complex, it becomes difficult. It becomes more difficult. So I am in support of 50%. I would like to round down, and I think we're really in a situation of seeing where the numbers lie. I mean, are we going to get more numbers if you increase the number required to take advantage of the incentive by number of development? So maybe your number of developments is smaller, but you get more units? Or would I rather see a lot more developments with diversity that really incentivize at least one, like in the case of the triplex? So I actually would be in support of starting with rounding down. I like Commissioner Ramey's idea of having this be part of monitoring to see if the incentive is actually achieving what the objectives are. Thanks.
All right, so I think at this point, I'm gonna ask my first straw poll question, which is supporting I've heard general support, so I'm gonna ask this one, which is rounding down, which would be, for an example, 1 unit in a triplex would need to be income qualified in order to get these incentives. That would also apply to odd numbers that come out of townhouse projects or cottage clusters. So is there general support for rounding down? I'll take that. All right, rounding down. And then is there support from the Planning Commission for the 50% being the threshold as opposed to all? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. All right, so this, and I'm just gonna, so to Commissioner Ramey's point about how well staff is doing, I'll introduce this slide where I noted today that there were some corrections needed to 3 of the incentives that I copy and pasted in a inappropriately here. So the incentive for income qualified units applies to, the lot area reduction, the density increase. So that's the townhouse situation. Since townhouses, their density is calculated a little bit differently. And then the parking reduction. So again, this is all three of these options are in the code currently for small unit incentives. And so these are just mirroring those small unit incentives and allowing them for income qualified. I did note here that the corrected versions would look like this, where the only corrections that are needed, it's actually in the example section of each piece. So it doesn't affect how the actual incentive works. It's just when I say, for example, a 3,500 square foot lot, et cetera, to make sure that those are meeting the income qualified example as opposed to the copy and pasted 900 square foot example. So these changes, if the Planning Commission supports these incentives, will be incorporated into the final version of the code. So Commissioner Taylor.
Thanks. I just want to, just for clarity for commissioners and the public, is the first one average, a portion of it is marked out, but not a portion? So the sentence actually doesn't make sense.
So it should say, for example, a 3,500 square foot lot created for, sorry, my lines didn't end up matching up there. So for example, a 3,500 square foot lot where all three units are income qualified would be allowed to reduce the minimum lot area requirement to 2,625 feet. So that's what that's intended to say. So you would scratch out essentially anything that's related to the 900 square foot limitation.
And then based on council direction, or I'm sorry, Planning Commission direction tonight, it would not be all three units are income qualified. It would be 50% of the units are income qualified.
That's correct, yeah. So I'll take a straw poll just to allow staff to correct this change into the final recommendation that's put in front of the Planning Commission. So support for staff fixing their mistake. Thanks, that's 6 hands up there. And so, I do want to open up an opportunity for any further comments or questions on these three incentives related to, we pretty much already talked about the lot area and the density increase. The parking reduction does basically say that the minimum off-street parking requirement shall be 0 spaces per unit. So each unit that is income qualified is not required to have an off-street parking space. So are there any questions or comments before we move on about these three, which are generally supported at the 50% round down option? Okay. So that was the last for the code items that we had. So staff will be bringing you the final version of the draft code. Commissioner Taylor, you have a question before I move on?
I just wanted to, are you going to have an opportunity really quickly tonight, if there are any other follow-up code items before we go into the Metro Plan Amendment section? Just let me know.
I think right now, I don't want to switch gears before we need to. So I'm happy to talk about something else if you want to.
Okay, great. I have just heard from the public and then looking back through the testimony, and quite frankly, I'm a little confused. And when I'm a little confused, I'm like, okay. And some of it might be clear. And it's just, I don't know this new code as well as you do intimately, Jeff. So talk to me a little bit. I'm going to stay high level just so that you can give, we don't necessarily have to get into the language of the code unless you think that's relevant. I did look through it again tonight. When we do, so let's say, for instance, there is a subdivision created with 3 lots, and all 3 lots create essentially middle housing. First question, the developer can go through a regular subdivision and not a middle housing subdivision. Is that correct? So they wouldn't be they wouldn't know it's middle housing. You would have a subdivision, you'd have these 3 lots created. Could the developer then, once the subdivision is approved, outright submit a permit for a triplex, for instance, on those lots if they meet the standards without going through a middle housing subdivision.
Yes, that's correct. If the lots meet the minimum lot requirement, the one caveat I will put on that is that we have allowed for lots to go down to a certain level. So, you know, traditionally lots in Eugene have been required in R1, I'll just use that as an example, need to be 4,500 square feet, right? But we are now allowing duplexes on lots as low as 2,250 square feet. So if you wanted to go through a subdivision and create lots that could have duplexes on them, you would be allowed to create lots that are 2,250 square feet, but you just have to note that that's why you're doing that. You wouldn't be allowed to develop single family homes on those lots. So that's why you would have to indicate that your development is intended for a certain type of development.
And you would do that at the time of a regular subdivision. You would allocate and identify that. So now let's say, so that's understood. Now let's say, okay, you've got this subdivision, you developed a few triplexes, you went through a regular subdivision, it was noted on there, you built some triplexes. And remember that triplexes don't need to be attached, right? They can be detached. And now you want to go in and you want to separate those individual 3 lots into micro lots that separate each of those individuals. So is that what then would require yet another, it would require a subdivision in middle housing, or what happens if and when you want to do that?
Yeah, you can. So if you, in this example, you developed a bunch of triplexes on the lots that you had already subdivided, and you wanted to then put each unit of middle housing on its own lot, you would go through a middle housing land division process to do so. Those units still remain part of a triplex, you know, according to the provisions and the purpose of the middle housing land division. I'll make one special note that we did make changes in version 2 of the draft code that allows you to go through those processes simultaneously if you choose to. So you could do a subdivision at the same time that you process a middle housing land division, so that, you know, essentially just to save time in the processing of it all, you would just have to have a development proposal for the middle housing in order to do that, to meet the requirements of the middle housing land division.
So is there, so the reason why I'm asking this is that, I mean, you'll know where, and I just want some context if staff or this was considered even before, you know, in model code, is that obviously one of the reasons why we're here is to basically incentivize more housing, because we're in a housing crisis. So you can see where kind of I'm going with this is now in that instance, you're having to go through 2 subdivision processes, and essentially the housing's already created. You've already gone through a subdivision, you have this triplex. Now you just want to have these be 3 different lots. You have to go through a brand new subdivision. Is there any pathway to kind of, I don't know if that's been explored. I know this is a bigger concept, but you can see why it gets burdensome. It's already exists. You've got separate ownership. And you know how they have condominialization at the state level? Was that, I'm assuming it's been explored. So if you can just talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the middle housing land divisions were, that whole process, which was required by the state, remember, through Senate Bill 458.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Was
Yes.
essentially introduced because the state recognized that condominialization was actually a big barrier to people being able to sell off individual units. It's such a, if you think a subdivision was a costly process, have fun going through condominialization. So essentially the middle housing land division is a pressure release valve on that process to say that, hey, here's a very simple process. If you look at the criteria for middle housing land division, it's significantly less than anything you would see in a traditional subdivision. So while yes, it does create a requirement to have applied a document and recorded materials and things like that, the actual standards and the criteria for approval of a middle housing land division is intended to reduce the overall burden compared to a typical subdivision. So that And those criteria were essentially set by the state, and we've incorporated those into the local code. And so, Lauren, I know I am treading probably on saying something wrong here, so please jump in.
No, that was a great explanation, Jeff. I just wanted to kind of circle back around Commissioner Taylor to, so in your example, in your original example, it sounded like the original subdivision was a situation where perhaps the developer didn't have a full plan for development of each of the lots. That it was just, we have this large lot, we know we want to subdivide so we can put multiple types of housing on, but could be single family, could be middle housing, we don't know.
Yeah.
In that situation, I think you would be required to do the two-step process because you just don't have that housing type identified when you're going through the initial subdivision. As Jeff pointed out, though, if you were in a situation where you said, okay, we've got this greenfield development, we want to subdivide into 3 lots, we know we want to put triplexes on each of those 3 lots, and we know we want to be able to sell each of the individual units of a triplex, you could run that original subdivision and the middle housing land division concurrently and just do it as a single process at the beginning, and then actually develop the middle housing after having gone through the subdivision and the middle housing land division at the same time. So it really just depends on kind of how sure the developer is at the beginning about what they want to do with the property. If you want to preserve options, then maybe you just go through that initial subdivision, you come back later to do the middle housing land division if you end up developing middle housing. If you know exactly what you want to do at the beginning, as Jeff pointed out, we amended the code to allow those to run concurrently so that folks aren't forced into a dual process if they already know that the outcome that they want is small middle housing lots.
And I would just say that one of the nice things about the middle housing land division is that you can do it before or after something is developed. So you can either do the middle housing land division with a plan in place that you're going to develop it this way, or you can say, hey, I've already got middle housing and I want to do a land division. So you can do it either before it's developed or after. It doesn't matter in terms of processing that. So
can I ask one more follow-up question? And that you'll see where I'm going to go with it is I wanted to kind of unpack it also for everyone else to be able to follow. Is there a way that, so here's more traditional development. A very common scenario is a subdivision's done by an owner, for instance, not a developer. And then maybe there are certain lots sold off for one developer. So you've got 2 different entities kind of in that relationship. But to kind of commence a process, kind of get some of the due diligence items, entitlements kind of set in order to launch something, it's not atypical. So now you've done that and you might have, whoop, we're back in the subdivision process. So is there a way that our code and what the legislature has passed down, some flexibility that potentially in the subdivision process that it can be a little bit more generic? Like if you did let's say you've got, I'm the owner, I don't know what I'm going to do necessarily. I'm going to try to find developers to develop these lots. Can I go into a middle housing subdivision that I say, it could be a duplex, it could be a triplex, it could be a quad. Is there a way we might be able to provide any element of flexibility so that first stage gives a little bit more speculation, opportunity for flexibility without causing force another subdivision? And that's my last question.
Lauren, do you want to take it or do you want me to?
I'll take it and you can tell me if you think I'm messing up. So Commissioner Taylor, I think the short answer is no, at least as far as Senate Bill 458 is concerned. The way that Senate Bill 458 is written, it contemplates a specific type of middle housing, a specific number of lots in the middle housing land division, because each lot has to have a unit of middle housing on it. So, and you need to be able to show easements for utilities and easements for pedestrian access and other things that I think it would be difficult to approve something that said, well, if it's a triplex, we'll do it this way, and if it's a duplex, we'll do it this way. So in terms of the middle housing land division, at least the way that Senate Bill 458 is written, it doesn't provide the flexibility to say, at some point we want to develop this with middle housing, we're not sure which type, and we'll get back to you. In terms of the traditional subdivision, you do have flexibility in terms of how large you make those lots. So if there's large enough to support any middle housing type, then there's flexibility in the type of middle housing that's ultimately developed on them. But I don't think there's no way to allow that kind of ultimate flexibility unless Eugene decided to do something very different than what is required by Senate Bill 458. And at this point in the process, I don't know that we have that time to figure that out.
Got it.
And Commissioner Taylor, just you can nod your head. Do you have any other items for further discussion on anything else in the code?
No, I mean, that was my big, I mean, you can understand why. I mean, procedurally, it's still actually, it's fairly cumbersome, and I mean, I see we're trying to get there. I would love I'd love to be able to facilitate some additional flexibility because of that potential two-part process, which I think might be inevitable. But, maybe this is something where great minds out there that might be able to come up with some solutions and work with you before city council, or if not, maybe as this evolves and moves through time, maybe there is, because I'm trying to think, there are, I think there might be methods to maintain consistency with 458, 2001, and maybe be able to allow some flexibility, and understood what Lauren described as really some of the infrastructure that needs to be proven. Okay, put the burden on the owner to do that, yet I still see an opportunity. Triplexes and duplexes aren't that different. So if there's still the ability to say, yeah, the utilities are going to run here, streets are going to run in here, I'm just not sure if this is going to be duplex or triplex. I still think that there's a possibility to potentially allow some flexibility while meeting really all of the criteria, more or less, except for the exact type of middle housing. But once again, yeah, anyways, yes, it answered my question.
All right, do any other commissioners, you can raise your hand if you have any other code questions before I move on to the Metro Plan Amendment. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. Give me a second. So the Metro Plan Amendment, this is, you've seen this many times before, where we are amending policy A9, which basically says that the maximum number of dwelling units per acre in the density ranges do not apply to duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. As we've been working through our findings and reviewing things, I do want to note that at the Planning Commission meeting on January 25th, staff is working to potentially look at a more robust version of this finding, or potentially adding to it, or looking into another policy that could really make sure that we're capturing the intent of and amending the Metro Plan appropriately to implement the House bill. So are there, you've already seen this a lot, but do you have any further questions or deliberations around the Metro Plan Amendment as it is before you right now? All right, so with that, I'm going to move on to talk about our findings. So on November 16th for the hearing, we provided a draft set of findings to the Planning Commission for your review, and they included things like, so the findings are kind of broken out. I look at it as kind of like three main components. You've got findings for the code amendments themselves. You've got findings for the concurrent Metro Plan Amendment. And then you have the just kind of state law findings that kind of exist floating out there on our own. So the middle housing code amendments, and this is dictated by our local code. We have to say that we're consistent with statewide planning goals, consistent with the comprehensive plan, and then consistent with the adopted refinement plans. And you see the note there, it says pending the refinement plans and those findings associated with demonstrating consistency. That's what staff's been working on over the last couple of months. And that's one of the reasons why we were looking at that metro plan policy, and we potentially want to add to it to ensure that we're maintaining consistency across the board. So those refinement plan findings, again, those will be provided to you prior to January 25th. We want to give you enough time to review those, and you'll have another opportunity to deliberate on those at the January 25th meeting. And so the concurrent metro plan amendment, again, you've got similar situations here where you have to be consistent with the statewide planning goals. You can't make the metro plan internally inconsistent, so you can't make it contradict itself. And then the last one is that it has to be consistent with Envision Eugene. And the last one is a state requirement around middle housing code amendments, basically requiring the city to consider ways to make middle housing affordable in one way or another. And as we discussed at length through deliberations, there's a lot of different ways through incentives and flexibility designed into the middle housing code amendments that we are achieving that affordability. So at this time, I do want to offer an opportunity for any questions, specific questions regarding the findings. Obviously, you have a subset of those findings for the refinement plans that will be forthcoming, but any questions for the ones that are before you at this time? All right, and Commissioner Fragler.
So I just from reading through our packet, I did notice that I can't remember which goal the Greenway is related to, the Willamette Greenway, but we are going to be doing that at a different approval process pace than we are the middle housing code amendments. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we're also working on simultaneously is a separate set of amendments for the Willamette Greenway and making that consistent with both the state law and ensuring that our local processes match up with that. So that is going to be happening on a separate track from this, but is essentially intended to meet it and support these code amendments as well. So that will be forthcoming as well. And so it'll have its own set of findings and draft code language and everything else like that. So it'll have to have its own public hearing, etc. All right, are there any other questions on this? All right, at that, I think if the commissioners and staff agree, maybe it's a good, Terry, do you want to, I don't know how long the remainder of our presentation is, if we want to move through the last bit of it, or if we just want to take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, I would ask for kind of the will of the commission to see if you want to take a break. We are scheduled to go until 8 o'clock if we need to. We may not need to, or we could take that time. That would be fine. The last couple of slides are, I want to ask each of you if there are things you want to make sure that we include in your draft letter to the city council, and then we'll work on that in between now and your next meeting so that we have a solid draft to bring to you on the 25th. So I have a slide to generate some discussion about that and then just next steps. So not a lot of slides left, but there will be opportunity for discussion about items that you'd like to highlight in your code recommendations. Chair Beeson, how are you feeling about a break?
I think we should take a break. I think we should take a, what time is it? I think we should take a 10-minute break.
Okay. I'm cool with that.
Thanks.
So we'll return at 7 o'clock.
share my screen again. Get us back to presentation. We all good there? I don't know why I went back to the beginning. Sorry about that. Bear with me here. Okay. So you will recall that the Planning Commission wrote a letter to the City Council at one other point in the process. That was back in May last year, after we had concluded most of the outreach that informed development of the code. So at that point in time, the letter focused mostly on the outreach process and the process of tracking the state rulemaking. And we were on the brink of kind of going into a lot of meetings where we actually drafted up specific sections of the code and went through different iterations. So since then, you've put a lot of work into actually developing a code and then holding a public hearing on that code and subsequently deliberating. So my initial thought for this next letter is to convey a lot of information through the last 8 months of your work in a 2 to 3 page letter, hopefully, that we'll bring to you for your review next time. And these are my initial thoughts. Engagement, I've listed them here. But what I thought I would do is go around and ask each commissioner, and I can take this off the screen to do this, but ask each commissioner if there are things that you would like to be sure that we include in our draft. And then we'll work to get that put into a letter that we'll bring back to the full commission. We also have an opportunity to further work on this with our committee resources. We have 3 commissioners that meet to help guide staff in development of things like this. So that's where we are in the process. I think I'll stop sharing since we've already got a hand. Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you, Terry. So I've been struggling to try to figure out and maybe articulate, and I'd love input from all of you. This process has been obviously really robust. We've heard from so many people. I mean, I don't think we've ever heard from so many people in any process. Certainly not since I've been on the Planning Commission. It's tremendously divisive, obviously. And I think that there's, a lot of different perspectives, and I think that we've done a really good job at incorporating those and listening to everybody. And I speak for myself, and I will say that I truly took every word to heart. What I'm struggling with, my husband and I own our home, and we were very, very fortunate to do that. And we also were very privileged to be able to even design and build our home. And we selected our neighborhood for a reason. And there were things that we really desired about where we live. And so when the community is reaching out and they have really strong, this is emotional for a lot of people, and I get it. And I hear people, and I want them to know that we absolutely, speaking for myself, hear you. But when I come into this role, I really, it's a challenge for me, because I actually have to try really hard to remove the hat that I wear that's just self-serving, that doesn't factor in the fact that we have been appointed for a reason, and our city council has been elected by the people for a very, very specific reason. And that reason is bigger than any one of us. And it's about having to listen to we have a problem that we have been tasked with trying to solve. And not everybody in our community gets to play the role that we play. And so I think it's really important that we communicate somehow to city council that their role is really important. And while they will have personal opinions, and they will hear from constituents that will feel very strongly about things, the constituents don't have the same responsibility to the community as our city council does, which is solving problems that affect all of us and trying to find solutions. And so I would love your thoughts on, you know, whether you agree with me or not, but I would like to find a way to somehow remind council or support them in knowing that there are tough decisions that they have to make. Not everybody will be happy, but that there is a task at hand, and we've gone through and done a really thorough job at trying to be problem solvers in this process. So I just, you know, I feel really strongly about that for myself and wearing my planning commission hat, and I take it very seriously. And I don't get to just decide what I want for my neighborhood and how close I want, you know, someone parking to my type. There's so many things. So I just kind of wanted to say that before we kind of engage in more detailed conversation about what we really want to say to council. So sorry, I'm kind of babbling, but thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Edwards. I think that's helpful. And I think it's a good reminder to staff that it's important to remind folks what the Planning Commission's role is. And we'll keep that in mind as we work on that. Yeah, I think it is a fine time to say what you want to make sure is included in the communication. I'm trying to land somewhere between brainstorming and detailed, like, you know, group writing of a letter, because we're not going to do that. But it's a little bit more than brainstorming. It's sort of like the question I'm asking is, as a commissioner in your ad hoc role, serving policy advisory function to the city council, what is it that you, as a commissioner, want to make sure that we include in this communication? And if I can get that from everybody, then we can, I think, produce something that will hopefully reflect what the will of the commission is and serve you up for a motion at your next meeting. So I'll just call on you, I guess, in the order that you raised your hands. I think Commissioner Isaacson was first.
Yeah, I think what Commissioner Edwards has said is correct in its entirety. I think that at any challenging time, there are always seeds of opportunity. And the seeds of opportunity here is we've gotten the first crack at it. The city council then takes what we have created and molds it into a generational document. And we've had the first crack at public comment, and both good and bad, in terms of the veracity, in terms of I think, well-established view by some that the outcome is already kind of predetermined, and I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And so if we can say to the council that we built the framework of the house, and it's your job to go in with the molding and the aesthetics inside there and draft a policy for the rest of us for that generational document, and that the issues surrounding affordability are things we can't really do on the Planning Commission, but you do. And it's a passion that is almost at the heart of almost every comment that we got, was that aspect of it. And so to draft this document simply as we have given it to them, without talking about affordability, big A and small a, without talking about how it affects marginalized communities, without having a conversation about how it impacts folks' ability to buy, stay in their homes, continue on living with elder care, is a huge miss, and one that we can't address in a document we hand to you. But we recognize, both from the community's response to us, but also in our own personal interactions that we've had with community members as our own personal opinions, that is a document that needs to be included within ours.
Thank you. Over to Commissioner Ramey.
Well, thank you, Terry. And thank you, Commissioner Edwards, for getting us started on this. I think you made me think about something that's very real to us, and well, all of us, because we live here in Eugene, and all of these changes affect our livability. And I think what we're afraid of is that it's a change for the worse and our livability is going to suffer. And I think what we're missing is kind of the context on two different scales for this. The first scale of context is that while we listen to public testimony about flexibility, about encouraging the more units of this type, about providing affordability, about lining up with transportation policy, we did that within the context of the rest of the code. And so the rest of the code, every decision we made, we were thinking about, well, how does that affect? What does a setback mean? What does coverage mean? Well, how tall can these buildings be? How does all of that affect the livability of our neighborhoods? So I don't think that's written here explicitly, Terry, but I think that's worth mentioning that while we were considering these changes and implementing them, we weren't doing it blindly. We have this background, we have this context behind us. And then secondarily, the other scale of the context is something I've talked about before, and I've asked for some of these details. I don't know that I've seen them yet, but it has to do with how many of these units do we actually expect? When we look at the HIP and when we look at the projection for future units in our community, I think it was 6,000. And then how many of those are actually going to be middle housing units? And how does that compare to the number of lots that could actually have middle housing on them? And when I do the math, it's an astonishingly small number. It's like 600 units. And it's spread over thousands and thousands and thousands of potential lots. And so it's not even one unit a block. It's like one unit every 5 blocks or something. And I don't know if I'm making those numbers up, but I think it's worthwhile to have that context, because when we think about change, we want to think about the scale of that change, both on the sort of micro, what's happening right next to our property line. And that's what we try to pay attention to. And then the macro, what's happening throughout the communities. So even if it does happen next to it, how many of these are likely going to be in my neighborhood? What is my share of this middle housing? And how is that going to affect the quality and the fabric of my neighborhood? So I think, Terry, if we can weave some of those things in there about the change and the context of the rest of the code, and then just the scale of change. How much of this change are we really talking about? And I do have another comment, but I'm going to save it for another round.
Thank you, Commissioner Ramey. Next is Commissioner Fragla.
Thank you. I think one thing that I've really noticed about our process is that we started with a really strong public input process. And I've seen this planning commission repeatedly return to the values and themes that we heard. And so I think it's really important to emphasize we're implementing a state law. When you look at the requirements in this code, much of it is implementing the state code. We've not gone wild and crazy here. Much of it is implementing the state law. And when we have created a difference between the model code and created something that was different, we really used those values that we heard from the community as our guiding light, as well as the public input that we have continued to receive. And I think that's really important that we remind the council that we have entered into this process as the citizen oversight committee for this community. And I think that's what Commissioner Edwards was trying to get at. I don't represent the ward that I live in. I represent every person within this community. And in particular, I think about the next generation that I have to make decisions for. And I love that in our input process with the Healthy Democracy Committee, we created the composition of that committee to be based on the demographics of our young children in our schools. And so I think that's a really important piece. I also would like to communicate to council that we have taken a deep dive in this. I'm not a housing developer. I'm not a planner. I know a lot about middle housing. I mean, we've become the experts in some way. And I really hope that they value the hundreds of hours that we've put into this work. I know that they won't have the same amount of time, and as well as the expertise of our planning department. So I hope we can communicate that in some way. And then I think the ways we've really stretched to embrace how we can in this limited venue of code really push for smaller units, really push for affordable housing, really push for more diverse housing. It wasn't easy, and we did the best we could. And I also really support the monitoring ideas that Commissioner Ramey has brought to us in previous meetings, and hope we will include something about that in our recommendation and in our letter.
Thank you, Commissioner Fragala. Commissioner Beeson.
I agree with everything with everything that's been said. I appreciate Commissioner Edwards kicking this off. I want to say that I think part of what I heard you say a couple of things, one of which it clearly there's been a lot of different opinions about this across the community, and a lot of different opinions. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I also, the idea of providing whatever as we provide a recommendation to the council, and we provide what we think the important themes are, things to watch, is that we're thinking about supporting them and helping them get positioned to make the best decision they can. And I appreciate what Commissioner Fragala said. There were a number of things she touched on, which I've been thinking about. And I may paraphrase a little bit. For me, when I think about this letter or this recommendation, what we're doing, I think it was impossible for me to go through this whole process and not begin to develop some pretty strong opinions about middle housing and all of the things that I learned along the way, the different people that we talked to, the different people we heard from on healthy democracy and from around the community. And I've tried, I guess for better or worse, to just kind of center myself, starting a number of months ago, and the understanding that we've clearly got a housing crisis. And a lot of people recognize that. There's a lot of data on it, and we've been talked to about it. We've learned about it. We also have, I think, not to understate it, but we've got a climate crisis. We have a number of issues going on there, and we have things going on in our community that are beginning to address those. And there's this convergence of the housing crisis, climate crisis. And so I think as I go forward and try to figure out how to put all this together, I think it's important that, and Commissioner Fragala touched on this, but this is a House bill that we're implementing. And I think a lot of what we have put together in the code amendments and so on is just implementation of this state law. And we've talked about discretion before, that word. And I think a lot of it, and I'm not going to try to parse it out, but there's a lot in here that we're really required, assuming we're going to follow the law, we're really required to do as a city in Oregon at this point because of this House bill. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be bringing in the recommendation. And that includes the set of regulations that the state has for how we implement this across these administrative rules. And for me, it's really come down to, there are a number of those amendments in the state regulations, whether they're building height or lot coverage or the parking minimums or there's a number of them. There are 5 or 6, and they have captured a lot of discussion on the part of this community, a lot of discussion on our part. And when I come back and I think about, okay, this is really about addressing the housing crisis. It's about providing the opportunity in the community for development of affordable, more affordable housing. Those several amendments where we are recommending going to encourage or incentivize, in my mind, become extremely important. And they are going, we have had people giving us testimony saying, gosh, you shouldn't do all that. You should stay with the minimum. And I believe the council is going to continue to hear that. I think that's an area where there is discretion. And I would want somehow to weave into this letter our encouragement for them to as much as they can, to not step back on those, to go ahead and go with those recommendations we're making to the extent they can, because that's really where I think we can achieve a lot of gains in terms of affordability. And I think they're just going to have a lot of pressure on that. So when I've thought about this letter and I've thought about what we're trying to do, I think we just try to stay really, it's all about housing, clearly, obviously, but it's about affordable housing and creating that opportunity across the community for the development of it. So, and quickly, I'd say in terms of the support to them, and I think we've talked about this or tried to say it before, there's a whole number of things the city's done for the last 20 years that this is entirely consistent with. The pillars in the comprehensive plan, the climate action plan. There's just a whole number of the housing pipeline documents, all of the initiatives the city's doing. And I think there's an opportunity, or the council can find a place to stand in there consistent with those documents or those policy positions. And I think and look to support the recommendations we're making. So I'll kind of stop it there, but thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Beeson. I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm sitting here really listening to you all because Sophie has volunteered to take careful notes. So thank you, Sophie, in advance, and we'll also have the recording. So next, Commissioner Taylor.
Good luck, Sophie. It's good that's being recorded. So I don't need to repeat a lot of what's said. I agree with kind of scaling. I like the kind of why, how, what. Commissioner Ramey, Commissioner Fragola, Commissioner Edwards, they kind of address kind of the relative scale. If you look at kind of goal down to action, right? The one thing that I haven't heard that I think it's really important, and it's that reminder of, because this is, Commissioner Edwards started out with, this is an emotionally charged subject. We all know it. We've had conversations, and the conversations are very diverse and extremely passionate. A lot of the times, it's getting to the essence of really home. So with that said, this is an opportunity, and I'm actually quite proud to be living in the state of Oregon, that we're taking this position to look at next generation, to really address the housing crisis and address the history of kind of exclusionary zoning and honestly discrimination. So I do think that when we talk about the why, it has been a topic of all the boards. We have had input from all parts of the community, rather than historically it was predominantly those of privilege that were the vocal and the influence in policy. And I think here's our opportunity to, rather than think as in neighborhoods or think in wards, is to really look at, like, the Planning Commission at large. Who are we as a community and what do we want? And we are following the state. Everything Commissioner Ramey said in terms of providing that context. It's not like we're not doing something that wasn't well thought out and being mandated by the state And we are just carrying on those steps and actually providing consistency with a lot of elements that are already in our code. So I don't have anything more to say other than that one piece that I would like that reminder of just where we've come from as in the world of planning in the United States, and start high, doesn't have to be a lot, and get to where we are now. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other hands raised, but Commissioner Edwards, did you finish or did you have more to say? And if not, we have Commissioner Ramey with his hand up again. We'll go to you, Chris. Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you, Terry. So I did say I had another point, and Commissioner Frageler mentioned it briefly about the monitoring and evaluation process. But before I get into that, or actually a way to get into that, was I heard a lot of testimony that was essentially just do the state minimum. Just do that and see what happens. So I don't necessarily agree with doing the minimum, and we didn't do that, obviously, and we listened to our testimony and we followed. We tried to improve on that, and we fine-tuned it for our circumstances here in Eugene. But I do agree with the let's see what happens part. And I think we owe it to ourselves and the greater community to really, really follow up on that hard and say, yes, we're out here, we're doing something new and different. We think it's very important, but we also want to be sure we did it right and that it works, and that we have a mechanism in place that allows us to understand, did it work or not? If it worked, how can we keep doing the parts that work well? If it's not working, how can we change those parts so they work better in the future? And so I really think we need to have some sort of firm message to the council that says, this is something you need to strongly endorse, very systematic, maybe even I'd use the word rigid, but a rigid schedule that says in 5 years, we're going to do this. And we're going to look and see where we've been, how we line up with the original goals of the project. And then we're going to look at those results and we're going to say, okay, where do we go forward from there? Now, the details of how you do that, I'm not sure. But I think if we don't get the council to commit to that and don't get them to commit to funding on that, we will have really done our community a disservice. So I'd really like to be sure that we include that in our letter to them, and volunteer to help to be part of that. Maybe we're the monitoring committee. We receive the data, and we analyze the data and say, here's based on the data compared to so that we're not just handing it off. We're saying, okay, we'll take that ourselves. But I think it's really, really important that we do that. I think it builds confidence. Many of the neighborhood leadership is nervous about this kind of thing that never happens. You say you're going to do that and you don't. Well, let's flip that. Let's say, let's do it. let's really commit to it and show that to the council. We'll be there for them.
Thank you. Commissioner Edwards.
Sorry. So Commissioner Ramey, I definitely, I wholeheartedly agree with you, but I wanted to mention something, and I think the commission's going to be getting more information coming up, but that work is happening with the, I've been part of the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, so ETAC. I serve on that body representing the Planning Commission, but also wearing other hats. But it is extremely detailed, and so the work of growth monitoring and evaluating how the policies have played out over a period of time, that actually is something that staff, I will commend them, but they've been digging really deep into this, and so I've been sitting on that for 3 years now, and it's a tremendous amount of work, and you will all be getting a presentation in the next month or so. So I just wanted to let you know, but when I think about that, and I think about that's exactly what that group is tasked with doing, is evaluating how policies have played out and did they work, or incentives, all kinds of different things, and that's exactly what that group is tasked with doing. So it's it's exciting to see that happening. And I think that you guys will be very pleased to know that that is happening. So anyway, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's coming.
Thank you, Commissioner Edwards. Yeah, we should be looking at maybe a March meeting for presentation of the growth monitoring report. The ETAC is still looking at it, and there is a lot of crossover. There are already a lot of things in the report that relate to what we're doing with middle housing, but we could be explicit. And that's what I hear from Commissioner Amy's comments, is that we'd like to be explicit, that we want to monitor the outcomes of the middle housing code amendments and incentives and. So thank you for that. Okay, that was all really great input. I would think I'll share my screen again. We just have a couple more slides, and then I think we might even have time for Alyssa to give you some planning director updates. So, did that work better this time? I'm so out of practice, you guys. I'll just let you read this in your packet. It's a bunch of words.
Your notes are there.
Really? Come on. Sorry, guys. Thank you, Kristen. There we go. Well, my notes were basically, did we miss anything? And we did. So thank you for that discussion, for pointing out things that you'd like to highlight, especially or including the monitoring of the middle housing outcomes. Things like number of units, affordability, whether the incentives are working, all those things. Great stuff. Okay, so we made it through all of our items tonight. Congratulations. We know that we're going to be bringing you back some additional findings to look at prior to your January 25th meeting. And at that meeting, we'll not only discuss your letter and the findings, but also ask you for a formal motion to formalize your recommendation. So that's what we'll plan on doing on the 25th. And then in February, once we have your recommendation in hand, we'll hold another info session on the Planning Commission's recommendation. And like I mentioned before, update our guide to the adoption process is into a guide to the Planning Commission's recommendations. We are scheduled to go to the City Council on March 9th, and we have a poll out to you to see if you're able to join, at least a couple of you. At this point, we just have 45 minutes on that work session, but that is on the calendar. And then we're very close to scheduling the council public hearing. We'll probably know by tomorrow, but it's not yet on the published calendar. So sit tight on that. And I just already said all of this, so I could stop. Any other final questions or comments on this project? Can't see all of you right now. Hold on. Oh, okay. Then I guess I'll kick it over to Alyssa, and many, many thanks for your hard work on this. It's been really great.
Terry, you're still screen sharing.
Oh my gosh, you guys.
Sorry, we're getting to read the Metro Plan. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Yep. Thank you all. It's good to see everyone. I did miss your December meetings. I heard those went well. You've obviously been very thorough and thoughtful in your deliberations, as you always are. So that's great to see. I just have a couple of really quick updates. Just a reminder that the PC recruitment, or the Planning Commission recruitment, is open for our vacancy, and that closes at the end of the month. And as always, we find you all to be very good recruiters. So please let your people know, let your groups know that there's an opening. And then Linda sent you an email. Well, she sent you one email that had some polling dates for some meetings in March. We're looking to shift things around because of spring break. And then you'll get another email probably later this week about some potential dates for the land acknowledgement training. And I think that's actually the only update I have at this point. I sent you the schedule. guess that was yesterday, and we're going to be, filling out first couple of months here pretty soon as we're just working on some work planning right now. So it's possible that you don't have any meetings in February. So just a heads up with that. And it looks like Commissioner Fragla has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to check in about the recent update to our committee assignments. Will we automatically be added to those communication groups and can we start to get like the schedules for those work groups?
Sure. Yeah, the project managers all have those, and they will be contacting you, kind of like Terry does with the middle housing one. They're more ad hoc. There's not necessarily, most of those subcommittees are ad hoc and don't have a scheduled meeting time, but project managers will be reaching out to you.
I'm thinking of more the bigger things.
Oh, the bigger things. Did you get, I can't remember what everybody, I can double check on that. Did you get added to something and I need to
Yes.
follow up on? Okay. All right. I will follow up on that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I was going to say, I think we're getting about ready to adjourn. I was going to ask if there are any other items that commissioners have. Any other comments or anything else they want to talk about? Okay. So I guess with that, we'll be coming back to, Terry?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to mention an upcoming meeting on the Moving Ahead project, which is a joint effort between LTD, the Lane Transit District, and the City of Eugene. So over the years, the Planning Commission did have representation on the sounding board for that project. There was a big pause in the project during the pandemic. It's been revamped and is going to a joint work session on February 28th. And that is, I'll be there, Rob Interfeld will be there, and LTD staff. And Commissioner Edwards will be there. And then decision-making will follow in March at both bodies. So that's pretty exciting because it advances some of the higher level coordination projects and goals that we have between the city's transportation plan, land use vision, and LTD's long-range transit plan.
And speaking of council, they're going to be reviewing the housing implementation pipeline on the 24th and possibly taking action on it as well.
Okay. I guess we'll see everyone on the 25th. I'm not seeing any additional hands, so I think I'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.